At exactly 2:43 p.m. in the House Judiciary Committee room, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett rose from her chair with the kind of controlled fury that makes seasoned politicians take notice. What she was about to reveal would connect Pam Bondi's nomination to a surge in political violence that most Americans never knew existed. Her words would expose a dark truth that the establishment desperately wanted to keep hidden. "Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice carrying an edge that immediately silenced the room's background chatter. But those who knew Crockett could hear something different in her tone. This wasn't going to be typical committee business. The Texas Democrat had spent the previous night in her Capitol Hill office, surrounded by FBI threat assessments and stacks of disturbing messages that had flooded her inbox since Pam Bondi's nomination was announced. What she discovered in those files would have shaken anyone's faith in American democracy. "And I first just want to begin with a news alert," she continued, her eyes scanning the committee members with laser precision. "Guess what? Joe Biden is not the president anymore." The bluntness of the statement caught everyone off guard. Republican members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the usual diplomatic language of congressional discourse. This was someone who'd had enough. So maybe we can move on. Maybe we can move into the present because it seems like we are living in the past." But what Crockett knew and was about to reveal was that the present had become far more dangerous since Trump's team began announcing their nominees. The death threats against Democratic committee members had tripled in the weeks following Bondi's nomination announcement. The connection wasn't coincidental. "And listen, these are not the good old days," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You know, like you used to sit around and your grandparents would talk to you about what used to happen." Behind her measured words lay a brutal reality. Crockett's own security detail had been increased twice since December. Her staff had been trained in evacuation procedures. Her family had been moved to undisclosed locations after credible threats were received at her Houston office. What we need to be talking about is how we are going to legislate, because I think that some of my colleagues have confused what our jobs are. The confusion she referenced wasn't academic, it was deadly. In her preparation for this hearing, Crockett had uncovered a pattern of harassment that directly correlated with the inflammatory rhetoric coming from Bondi's supporters on Fox News and other platforms. Every time Bondi appeared on television defending her positions, the threat level against her critics spiked dramatically. And I get that we're sitting in judiciary, and so it may seem as if we are here to be litigators, but we are here to be legislators, which means that we are supposed to be writing laws, not trying to have our own trials and determine whether or not something is true or not. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. While committee members debated Bondi's qualifications in air-conditioned hearing rooms, real Americans were making life or death decisions about whether to continue serving in public office due to the escalating threats. All I know is that a great American hero, a good senator out of New Jersey, said something to the effect yesterday as he was shattering the record for holding the floor. She was referencing Senator Cory Booker's historic filibuster, but what most people didn't know was that Booker had received over 200 death threats during that 24-hour period. The threats had become so specific and credible that Capitol Police had to establish a security perimeter around his office. A record that had been held by another racist in this country, Crockett continued, her voice carrying the weight of historical understanding. As he shattered that, he said something about the fact that this should not be about left versus right. It should be about right versus wrong. But the threat assessment reports on her desk told a different story. The messages weren't coming from concerned citizens engaging in democratic debate. They were coming from radicalized individuals who'd been convinced that Democratic politicians posed an existential threat to America. And many of these messages referenced Bondi's media appearances as justification for their violent fantasies. "And I am going to tell you that I want us to focus on right versus wrong," she declared, her voice gaining strength. "The reason that we are struggling right now in this country as it relates to people not trusting agencies, honestly, a lot of it is because of elected leaders." The connection between rhetoric and violence had become impossible to ignore. FBI analysts had briefed Crockett's security team about the specific language patterns they were seeing. Words like enemy of the state, traitor, and communist appeared repeatedly in threats against Democratic members, the same language Bondi used regularly in her Fox News appearances. "Let me tell you, One of the things that the chairman and I actually agree upon, we don't agree on a lot, is that we both know that there has been a sharp incline as it relates to threats upon our lives. This was the moment Crockett had been building toward. The revelation that would expose the true cost of the current political climate. Republican Chairman Jim Jordan, despite his partisan positions, had privately acknowledged to Crockett that threats against all committee members had reached unprecedented levels. Regardless of what side of the aisle you sit on, we both know and agree that as sitting members of Congress, we both are enduring more death threats than anybody should in this country. The statistics were staggering. Capitol Police had documented a 340% increase in threats against House Judiciary Committee members since November 2024. The timing directly correlated with the announcement of Trump's controversial nominees, particularly Bondi for Attorney General and Kash Patel for FBI Director. But the most disturbing pattern was the specificity of the threats against Bondi's critics. Unlike the generic anger that typically accompanied political controversies, these messages contained detailed personal information about committee members' families, home addresses, and daily routines. Someone was clearly coordinating and amplifying the campaign of intimidation. And I believe that it is because of the divisive rhetoric, and it is because of the selective enforcement of things. Crockett's voice carried a tremor not of fear, but of controlled rage. She'd seen the internal security briefings. She knew about the organized campaigns to dox Democratic committee members. She'd read the transcripts of social media groups planning visits to critics' homes. What the public didn't know was that 3 Democratic committee members had already received preliminary relocation offers from Capitol Police. The threats had evolved beyond angry emails to detailed surveillance reports of members' families and specific plans for violence. And so when we have, and I'ma be clear because I had remarks and I'm going a whole other way. This was the moment Crockett deviated from her prepared statement. Her staff later revealed that she'd originally planned a measured critique of the confirmation process. But sitting in that room, surrounded by the visible tension and knowing what she knew about the threats against her colleagues, she decided the American people deserved the truth. The whole other way she was about to go would expose the connection between Bondi's nomination, the inflammatory media coverage, and the unprecedented surge in political violence. It was a connection that law enforcement officials had documented, but political leaders had been reluctant to acknowledge publicly. In the 48 hours following Bondi's first Fox News appearance defending her nomination, Crockett's office received 47 specific death threats. The messages weren't random, they referenced specific statements Bondi had made about radical Democrats and the need to clean house in the Justice Department. Similar patterns emerged for other Democratic committee members who'd questioned Bondi's qualifications. Representative Eric Swalwell received threats that referenced his treasonous questioning. Representative Hakeem Jeffries was targeted with messages that quoted Bondi's characterizations of Democrats as enemies of justice. The correlation was undeniable, but until this moment, no one had been willing to call it out publicly. What made Crockett's revelation particularly powerful was her credibility on these issues. As a former public defender who'd prosecuted domestic violence cases, she understood the psychology of intimidation. She recognized the patterns of escalating threats that often preceded actual violence. The divisive rhetoric she referenced wasn't abstract political positioning. It was a coordinated campaign to silence opposition through fear. And Pam Bondi's media appearances had become the primary vehicle for escalating that campaign. The most chilling example in Crockett's files involved a threat against her colleague Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The message, sent 3 hours after Bondi appeared on Tucker Carlson's show, contained specific references to Bondi's comments about radical socialists in Congress and included detailed plans for violence that caused Capitol Police to recommend immediate relocation. But the threats weren't limited to high-profile progressive Democrats. Even moderate members who'd asked routine questions about Bondi's qualifications found themselves targeted. Representative Josh Gottheimer, hardly a progressive firebrand, received threats after simply asking about Bondi's views on independent investigations. The pattern suggested something more organized than spontaneous political anger. Intelligence analysts had briefed committee leadership about potential coordination between Bondi's media appearances and the timing of threat surges. The The sophistication of the operation indicated resources and planning that went far beyond individual extremists. What particularly alarmed security officials was the evolution in threat specificity. Early messages were generic expressions of anger, but as Bondi's media campaign intensified, the threats became more detailed, more personal, and more credible. Someone was clearly providing targeting information to the people making these threats. The psychological warfare was working. 3 Democratic staffers had already resigned, citing concerns for their families' safety. 2 committee members had canceled public events in their districts. The normal functioning of democratic governance was being disrupted by calculated intimidation. Crockett's decision to go public with these revelations required considerable courage. By connecting Bondi's rhetoric directly to the threat increases, she was making herself an even bigger target. But she'd concluded that the American people deserved to know how their democracy was being attacked. The immediate aftermath of her statement would prove her point. Within hours of the hearing, social media platforms exploded with attacks on Crockett, specifically referencing her criticism of Bondi. The threats against her office tripled overnight. But this time, the pattern was so obvious that even mainstream media outlets couldn't ignore the connection. Her warning to the American people was stark. When political rhetoric becomes indistinguishable from incitement, democracy itself is under attack. The nomination of Pam Bondi had revealed how easily political opposition could be transformed into personal danger for those brave enough to serve in elected office. The most shocking element of Crockett's revelation wasn't the existence of threats. Political figures had always faced some level of harassment. It was the organized nature of the campaign and its direct connection to specific media appearances by Trump's nominees. FBI counterterrorism analysts had been tracking these patterns for months. Their classified assessments, portions of which were shared with committee leadership, painted a picture of sophisticated information operations designed to weaponize extremist violence against political opponents. The Bondi nomination had become a test case for how effectively this new model of political intimidation could operate. If critics could be silenced through orchestrated threat campaigns, the normal constitutional process of advice and consent would be replaced by rule through fear. Crockett's courage in speaking out represented more than political theater. It was a defense of democratic institutions under unprecedented attack. Her revelation that death threats had spiked specifically since Bondi's nomination forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth about how their political system was being subverted. The warning she delivered to her colleagues and the American people was simple but profound. When questioning a political nominee becomes grounds for death threats, democracy has already begun to die. The only question was whether Americans would recognize the danger in time to stop it. Her decision to abandon her prepared remarks and speak directly about the threat she and her colleagues faced every day would resonate far beyond that committee room. It would force a national conversation about the true cost of political extremism and whether American democracy could survive in an environment where opposition had become synonymous with treason. The shock wasn't just in what she revealed, it was in the courage required to reveal it, knowing that doing so would only make her a bigger target for the very forces she was exposing.